Mary and I took similar cruises to the British Isles, hers about a week after mine on a large ship and a different route. I'm gloating because I had a week of perfect sunshiny weather. So why did I decide to take this trip? Friends, chums, as they say in England, they are just the best. My chum Barbara alerted me to this National Trust tour about historic castles and gardens in the British Isles. You should come, she said. Well, I like castles and gardens and flowers. My passport's up to date. Let's go. So 2 weeks later, I was packed, flying nonstop out of San Diego to London on British Air.
Great.
So some of you know that I drive a hybrid Jeep. It's electric. The travel brochure explained to me that our small ship Vega is one of the few environmentally responsible ships that leaves a minimal footprint because of its hybrid engines and its unique water filtration system. It intrigued me that San Diego's very own Dr. Nigella Helgarth will be giving lectures on the Vega. You may know that she's a scientist and was executive director at the La Jolla Birch Aquarium. She has researched the role of climate change. Boy, we've got a lot of that right now. And she did that along the shores of the very gardens that we are about to explore. So here we are to compare our voyages.
Oh,
Here's Barbara, my good friend. Scope out the lounges before you go. We met at the gate 51 at 7 p.m., lugged her suitcases to the other end of the airport where the lounge was, and we walked so far that we were too tired to get back. So she got a glass of champagne and I got a bag of chips. On board the flight after supper, those chips were really yummy to munch on while I binge watched 3 movies. Did I sleep? 10 hours and 25 minutes later, we were looking for our driver's paging sign at the Heathrow Airport exit. Now that night was a welcome dinner for our fellow travelers at Southampton's Leonardo Royal Hotel. It was very nice. And the next morning, after a good English brekkie, we boarded the bus for our first garden estate at Montesfont. Now I'm anticipating there's going to be so little time to see all these flowers, but do you see the lily of the valleys? It's the third one down on the left. That's my favorite. And here we go to Montesfont. They didn't have any flowers in that grid. Sorry about that. But the abbey's name comes from the font, the crystal clear spring that flows here by the river Test. Yeah, it's T-E-S-T. Minty, rich uncles and very wealthy businessmen wanted to show all of his great wealth. So William Brewer, who had become British of Exeter, began to build the priory and the gardens, and that was in 1201. So you will see 50 and 60 plane trees lining the walkways. See it in the center? They're huge. They can live for several hundred years, and their bark is distinctive. It has an olive gray camouflage color with large scaly plates that peel off to reveal their creamy bark that's underneath. The leaves might remind you of a sycamore tree. I think of Canada's maple leaf. You can see part of a plane tree in the picture of the abbey there. It's kind of far away, but it's on the right-hand edge. I loved strolling on the brushed dirt walkways to the stables and the walled garden and the National Plant Collection of ancestral roses. Fast forward. to 1934, when Maud and Gilbert Russell arrived. She was the wealthy patron of the arts and fell in love with the Abbey House and the grounds. It's not the only thing she fell in love with. The country estate became her family's playground for fishing and riding horses. She entertained artists and writers and commissioned designer friends to enrich the Abbey. So she also fell in love with a Russian, Boris Anrep, well known for his mosaics, and he created this window of the angel with Maud's face. Maud and Boris soon became lovers. Simply scandalous, a spicy, lovely first garden. So now to the Vega. Unpack my suitcase in my modern, very comfy stateroom. I'm back at the V, but I'm dining with new friends. Not on this particular picture. That's the Zodiac. A Zodiac without mishap. Absolutely. First, you have to have a life jacket lesson. Get the straps straight, especially the ones between your legs, and then the sailor's grip. The sailor's grip is like this. You put your arm out, and the crewman will grab your arm, your forearm, not your hand, and you return the favor and grab his arm too. Try it. So if you're ready, do the sailor's grip, step down onto the top of the dancing raft's tubby side and into the bobbing Zodiac. It's a lot of fun, but don't miss. Do not walk to your seat. Sit down and slide along on your tush. Grab the ropes that are there and hang on, and you're riding on the back of a motorcycle. Whee! But it's a bit wet. The Zodiacs turned this trip into an adventure, not a tea time floral show. Oh, these cobblestones. What an arduous trip climbing up to the mountain. Raggedy black seaweed lay in the sand next to this walkway while the tide was out. That was the only time you could cross the causeway. Further up became smaller cobbles that were different sized and laid out on uneven ground. You should have had on ballet toe shoes. So St. Michael's Mount, look at those steep steps. Everything was up. St. Michael's Mount is the most famous castle of Cornwall, England. And it may remind you of France's Mont Saint-Michel, but no. Paris Gardens from 1878 are tucked around the back of the mountain, and were filled with a surprise. Magnificent, exotic succulents. Wish I had a picture for you. I took 1,000 pictures, so I have one. But this was San Diego's flowers. Even though the salty winds may gust, the plants are protected because the big rock acts like a radiator, keeping everything here warm and moderate. Sunday, it was the Isle of Scilly, Tresco Abbey Gardens. In 1834, it was a time when it was very fashionable to collect new species and bring home exotic plants from all over the world. Augustus Smith, a British politician and philanthropist, wanted to build a Mediterranean garden. So he left Hertfordshire, England, and made Tresco his new home. As his garden expanded, he planted Monterey pines and Monterey cypress trees. This tree happens to be a yew tree, but these Monterey pines were from California. They would protect his plant beds underneath the big trees from the Atlantic Ocean and all the winds. But in 1987, there was a devastating storm that took out much of those plantings. So the garden was further redesigned. New shelter beds, stone walls, and hedges now protect different ground levels, which I found very interesting because it created diverse microclimates within perhaps as little as 10 vertical feet. That required appropriate planning in each different zone. So the rhododendrons were gorgeous. They originated in the Himalayas, where the soil is very moist and acidic. There are over 1,000 species and subspecies. They're the national flower of Nepal. They are state flower of Washington and West Virginia. Watch some golf next spring at Augusta National Golf, and you will see those rhododendrons just as beautiful as these surrounding the greens. Okay, off to Bantry Island. We passed these lobster pots and fishing nets that lined the shores of the village road as we drove to the Earl of Bantry's home, where the White family has lived. Richard White, look at this house. It's Georgian. It's Victorian. It's Queen Anne. He built this house and put the house itself on the 3rd terrace of 7 terraces. They say the famous 100 steps, which are around in the back and you can't see. I didn't see them either. I don't remember what happened. Maybe the zodiacs are getting to me. I don't know. So off to Dingle. Several families nurtured this estate over the years, since the Blennerhassett family acquired the land way back in 1838. In 2006, Billy Alexander became the 5th family owner and caretaker of the Kells Bays Gardens. He turned it into Ireland's very famous Jurassic Park. He wanted to ensure the ability to have this garden be maintained so the tourists would do the trick. Strolling along under those trees, you would feel like you're in a prehistoric area, hobnobbing with friendly dinosaurs. And there I am. The wooden statues were carved from the garden's fallen trees. So Billy collected ferns as a young boy and became Ireland's leading fern expert, a pteridologist. His forest of over 600 tree ferns descended from a single mother fern from 1896. Inspired by his trip to the Himalayas, he added more specimens and strung up a long skywalk that you could travel over if you could stand the swinging. And they were over the Tasmanian ferns. Here we are. Wait a minute. No, we're not. We're in Galloway at Kylemore Abbey Castle. Dr. Mitchell Henry built this for his wife, Margaret. See, we need minty, strong, financially well-to-do men to build these things. Unfortunately, on her trip to Egypt in 1874, she contracted dysentery and she died at a young age of 45, leaving her grieving husband and 9 children. No wonder she went to Egypt. By 1920, the Benedictine nuns had turned the abbey into an international boarding school. But I was disappointed here. There's no time to visit the castle and the 6 acres of gardens. And hey, I went to the very famous Victorian walled garden, and there were no flowers. I think I'm getting googly-eyed. All right. Do you think that's really me climbing up there at the top at this UNESCO heritage site? The Giant's Causeway probably occurred 50 million years ago during an eruption. Volcanic lava penetrated the soft chalk in the ground and fractured it into these amazing hexagonal pillars. Does it remind you of Sheep Eater Cliffs in our own Yellowstone National Park? But giants, you ask, why? I have to tell you the legend. There were 2 giants, one named Finn McCool, who lived in Northern Ireland, and the other, a huge Scot named Brendan Donner, and he lived across the Irish Sea. Brendan Donner threatened Ireland, built a bridge in order to reach Ireland. So Finn retaliated by tearing up the Scottish shoreline. But when he saw how big Brendan Donner was, he fled, went home to Ireland. Now, lucky for Finn, his wife was quick-witted and clever. She dressed him up as a baby. So when Brendan Donner came looking and stomping, looking for Finn at home, he was shocked and began to think, if a mere baby is that big, the father must be far larger than he. So he fled back to Scotland, tearing up his causeway. That's kind of a cute legend. All right, sailing some more, we went off to Duart Castle, a feudal ancestral castle of the Maclean's clan. There were so many feuds over the centuries. I leave it to you to go look it up. Let's go to Stornoway, the Isle of Lewis in the United Kingdom, Scotland, and see the standing stones of Callanish. It's not England's Stonehenge.
No.
You can walk among these Neolithic megaliths. That's a mouthful. The stones are placed in a cruciform pattern. They were erected probably about the same time as Stonehenge, some 5,000 years ago. The locals called the stones Na Fir Brich, which means these were giants who were turned to stone for refusing to convert to Christianity. Now, the next site I really enjoyed, Garran Blackhouse Village and Museum. This was on the Isle of Lewis in Scotland. We began to wonder, what's that smell as the bus passed by the heath on our way to Blackhouse Village? It kind of smelled like licorice, but it was fields of peat. Go on Amazon, you can find peat pellets, peat bricks, peat fertilizer. Who knew? But it was all very interesting to me because we stepped back in time and experienced crofting life in this unique century-old Blackhouse village. The crofters occupied these homes until the 1970s, when as seniors, they found it too difficult to rethatch their homes every year and weave the wool for the famous Harris tweeds. So in this picture, you can see that double dry stone walls were covered with a roof of thick thatch, and it insulated the house against the severe Hebrides weather. Roof timbers were made of driftwood. Everything was natural. Notice that the stones holding it on the edge of the thatch roof are secured with ropes made from heather and marram, which is beach grass. Now, the crofters had a huge, well, this was the Iron Age, and this was their weaving machine. And I wish you could hear this guy speak. He had, his Scottish burr was wonderful. If we were in Ireland, it would have been a brogue. And now on to Inverary Gardens on the west coast of Scotland. I loved these gardens. These had to be my favorite. Tradition says that older sons inherited the lands of their fathers. Younger sons were left with the choice of becoming a soldier or joining the church. So it's 1862, and Osgood Mackenzie bought Inverary with the help of his mother. He was 20. When he began to clear this lump of land on the windiest coast, it was constantly lashed by gales. It was overrun by rabbits. It was filled with rocks. But he knew he could do it. And he knew that the North Atlantic warm current, it's called the North Atlantic Drift, that it would create a mild climate for this area, even though, I didn't know this, the latitude, it's more northerly than Alaska's Glacier Bay, if you happen to have a map. So he imported trees and buckets of soil from Ireland. It cost over £1 million to fix it. Are we okay?
Mhm.
Okay. Let's go on. I love this bamboozle. This was the most beautiful rhododendrons, huge trees laden with all these blossoms. They were so thick you thought you were walking in Hansel and Gretel's wood, only they didn't have the rhododendrons, poor things. All right, the next stop is the Isle of Man.
No,
Douglas. No, it's not.
Sky.
No, this is Dunvegan Castle, for Pete's sake. Wait a minute. Got it. We took a group photo here. Look on the front and you see in the turquoise jacket, there is our good friend Nigella Hillebrand, who did lectures on our Vega. So on to Dunvegan Castle, and this was a 13th century fortified castle, and it's always been fortified. Not all castles were fortified, but it is today the residence of Hugh Magnus MacLeod. He is the 30th chief of the clan. Goes on a long time. He inherited the 40,000 acres of the ancestral clan territories. And to make this estate sustainable, he keeps up the grounds for tourists, but he also has a background in films, and he has many films shot on the property. I'm sure you've seen Highlander and Macbeth. But you will find wide, wide walkways, if we'd had time to walk it all, with hand-hewn handrails on wooden bridges that curved across the streams, and it carried you through more greenery and spectacular rhododendrons. All right, this was fun. My one brief last stop was at the Isle of Man, Douglas, Scotland. The bus trip to Tinwell Hill on the way introduced us to the world's oldest democratic parliament. The Isle of Man is a self-governing possession of the British Crown, but this is too stodgy to tell you about all that. Lucky us. This was the weekend of the annual Isle of Man TT Tourist Trophy, mountain, circuit, motorcycle races. Barbara and I toasted the races with ice cream cones and the athletic, good-looking young guys who had just finished their trial race. 36 minutes at 135 miles an hour. This race has a lot of deaths, I'm sorry to say, but God forbid that we should drip any ice cream on their custom Douglas bikes that lined the street up and down. So then, our last stop, we were racing to go home. Home sweet home, Dublin, London, San Diego. Go for it, Mary.
All right, so now for a change of pace from the wonderful small ship that Martha described to the Zuiderdam, which holds almost 1,950 passengers. It's one of the Holland America Vista ships, and quite a different kind of itinerary as well. I flew over to Amsterdam 3 days early before my cruise so that I could go to some art exhibitions there. I'd gotten a ticket to the Vermeer exhibition at the Rijksmuseum, sorry, by going online the day that those tickets were offered. And it was lucky that I did, because they sold out very quickly. And then I also went on another day to see an exhibition at the Van Gogh Museum called Van Gogh in Auvers. And these were the last paintings that Van Gogh did before his untimely death. And you can see from looking at the picture that his mind was deteriorating at that time. I had an extra day, so I went shopping in Utrecht. There's a wonderful shopping mall right next to the train station there, and I really enjoy shopping, so that was a fun activity. Then Holland America was supposed to provide me with a transfer from Amsterdam to Rotterdam, but they messed up and the bus wasn't where it was supposed to be. And I ended up having to negotiate with a cab driver to take me all the way from Amsterdam to Rotterdam. I think I did pretty well in my negotiations, but it was kind of touch and go. And I was a little concerned because I really didn't want to try to find another cabbie or go back to the train station and try to get a train. So I was really, really glad when we solved all that problems and I got down to Rotterdam and saw the Erasmus Bridge and our cruise ship was on the other side.
Mhm.
Now, I met a lot of very nice people on the Zuiderdam, so I have actually no complaints about that aspect of the trip. Very early on in the cruise, I met a man who told me that he was having dinner at a particular table every night with some very nice people and suggested that I should join them, and I did, and that worked out great. But every night, leaving my room, I had to go into the elevator lobby and pass this ugly bench. And they advertised a spectacular art collection, but oh God, I really hated this bench. I think it was terrible. So I have to show you, that's the ugly part. Our first stop was in a town called Portland near Weymouth and Dorset. Portland was a place associated with D-Day because of American and Canadian military personnel trained there. It's an island, and you can go from there into the beach town of Weymouth, which I did in the morning. And then in the afternoon, I took an excursion that went along Chesil Beach, and the tour guide described the Jurassic Coast to us. And we went to the Abbotsbury Swanery, which is an ideal breeding environment for swans. And there are over 1,000 white silent swans there. And there are also some ringers, a few black swans from Siberia and so forth. But the kids were able to feed the swans. It was a lovely afternoon and a very relaxing experience. Next day, we were supposed to go to the Isle of Guernsey, and I was really prepared for that. I mean, like so many other people, I'd read that Guernsey Potato Peel Society book and other things about the wartime in Guernsey. And so I was well fixed for my excursion there, except that we weren't able to land. The weather was a little gray, but we didn't see the rough seas, but the harbor master refused to let us take the tenders into the port. And that was my first exposure to the reality that tendering can be a real challenge, because sometimes you can't use a tender, other times you have to wait a long time to get on one and so forth. And I looked ahead with a little bit of trepidation because many of the ports upcoming were tender ports. The next trip, however, was to Cornwall, where we stopped at Falmouth and I took a tour to Land's End. I could have taken a tour to St. Michael's Mount, where Martha went, but I read the description of that tour and they said it was very strenuous and I was chicken to do it. So I thought, well, what could be so bad about Land's End? Well, I don't know that it was so bad, but it was so not good. We passed by interesting things on the way, like the chimneys of abandoned tin mines and some pretty towns and so forth. And then we got to this real tourist trap place where the only thing of note is the sign at the very end. Now, coming as we do from a beautiful coastline to a okay, but nothing very special coastline did not strike me as being very exciting. And they people had organized it in such a way that you couldn't get a clear picture of the sign unless you paid them some money, because they parked a bicycle, a motorcycle right in front of it. And then a sign telling you how much you'd pay for personalized souvenir photographs. And if you wanted them to take a picture with your own camera, they would let you do that. They would take the picture for you, but they would charge you £5 for it. So the only thing I can say in favor of Land's End is that it has clean bathrooms. Next port was supposed to be Cove in Ireland, and I really was looking forward to this because this pretty town was the town that my mother left from when she moved to America in 1928. I mean, she didn't live there. Everybody went to Cove because that was a major port where many ships sailed to America and to other places around the world. And so there was an immigration museum there that I wanted to visit. But we were shunted out of the way by a larger cruise ship that got the only dock there. So we were told to dock in Ringaskiddy, which is across the estuary, and where the most exciting thing is the Pfizer manufacturing facility. So here is Pfizer in Southern Ireland, where they make the entire world's supply of Viagra. If you wonder where it's coming from, it's all coming from Ringaskiddy. We drove on further, and so we did see some lovely scenery. We went actually to a town called Kinsale, and that's a Bandon curve there on the way to Kinsale. So it was a pleasant day, but not a terribly exciting one. The next day was going to Dunleary, which is the port for Dublin. And again, it was a tender port. And I had arranged to meet my niece and her husband and her 2 teenage children on the dock at 10:30. And because they wouldn't let people off onto the tenders who hadn't got a booked excursion, I didn't get off until 11:30. And I took them, fortunately, they were happy to wait for me, and I took them to lunch in this wonderful restaurant in Dublin. My niece's husband drove us in, and we had a terrific meal here and such a good time that I forgot to take any pictures of them. So you'll have to take my word for it. They are real people, and they really do live there, and they have a very nice life in Dublin. They drove me back, of course, to the ship at the end of the afternoon. Then the next port was Liverpool. And this one wasn't a tender port. We actually docked right next to the Royal Albert Dock. And it was really an interesting place to visit. It seemed to me that Liverpool was a place that you could easily spend 3 or 4 days and enjoy seeing some of the museums that were there and some of the other opportunities for sort of urban life. It was a very lively place, and I really thought I would like it a lot. Here are some pictures of the kind of very solid architecture that the British Empire was known for. I mean, if you've ever been to Mumbai, they built buildings like this in Mumbai too. It was a statement I have always thought of how the British Empire was meant to last forever, and they were going to tell you so in stone. I took a tour which is called Panoramic Liverpool and Port Sunlight. So driving around, we passed a lot of sites associated with the Beatles. That's a very popular thing to do there. They've got all kinds of little museums, and this is a club and so forth. And there's a Beatles story museum on the Albert Dock, but they also have a museum, a maritime museum there, and a museum of international slavery as well. We crossed the Mersey via the tunnel, and this is a air vent from the building for the tunnel. Actually, I thought it was a beautiful building. You can take the ferry across the Mersey, like the song says too, but obviously most people nowadays, if they're not sightseeing, would go through the tunnel. And then we got to Port Sunlight. Port Sunlight was a planned worker community started in the 1890s by William Lever for his employees at the Lever Soap Factory. He was a believer in fresh air and high quality living for his employees. So instead of giving them money, which he thought they'd spend on drink, he built them houses. And the houses had 3 bedrooms each. Some of them had 4. And they had indoor plumbing and hot and cold running water. And it was all the services were in the back, and there were gardens back and front. And then there were all kinds of amenities like parks and playgrounds and bowling greens and a swimming pool and a theater. And it was just lovely. I mean, it was just such a nice and pleasant way to live. And I was very impressed by the fact that he created this at a time when worker housing and probably everywhere, but certainly in the British Isles, was pretty terrible. So it was a delightful place to see. He also built an art gallery for his art collection, and the Lady Lever Art Gallery was designed in 1913, opened in 1922 after the First World War. His taste in art was conventional for his day. He was collecting at the same time as people like Frick and Barnes and so forth, but he wasn't an adventurous collector. So he tended to rather traditional portraiture and to a collection of Wedgwood pottery and to pre-Raphaelites. Here's a couple. I think he liked luscious young women. So there were a lot of portraits of women in various stages of dress and undress. And here are several that he had collected. And this was my favorite. This was the Duchess of Cumberland by Gainsborough. I felt her face was very striking, and I learned that she was a commoner who married a brother of George III, and he was so incensed at his brother marrying a commoner that he arranged that the Marriage Act would be passed so that even to the present day, the relatives of the reigning monarch have to get the monarch's permission to marry. We too went to the Isle of Skye, as Martha did, but in most of these places, there are multiple excursions that you could take. On our ship, there were many different choices of excursions. Martha's ship being smaller, there probably were not very many, if any at all, but I could have gone many different places on Skye. I chose the scenic drive north. So I didn't see the castle that Martha visited, but I did see all the spectacular scenery, and it was absolutely gorgeous. I had a little family association with this too, because my great-grandfather, who was a farmer in Leitrim, used to bring in the hay on his property, and then he and his buddies would go up to Northern Ireland and sail over the sea to Skye and bring in the hay there. So I've always heard about the Isle of Skye. We visited a Croft Museum here, again, very similar to the one that Martha visited when she was at Lewis. And in our case, we saw a blacksmith shop, although that is obviously not a live blacksmith there, just a replica. Just a word about thatch roofing. The picture on the left is a thatched roof in southern England, in Dorset. And that's what I think of as a thatched roof. It doesn't have any kind of stones or anything keeping it down, because thatch doesn't blow off very easily. And so people would thatch their roofs because the materials were natural and readily available. The roofs themselves would last a long time, and there didn't seem to be a significant need to hold them down. Whereas the picture in the middle is from Martha's talk, and that's how they were held down with traditional materials on Lewis. On the Isle of Skye, they were held down by wire netting and stones. So obviously the wind velocity there must be tremendous, because otherwise I can't understand the reason for it. There were plenty of sheep to see in the Highlands. And as we were driving along, the tour guide talked to us a bit about the Highland clearances, which were a period of centuries when people were driven off the land in the Highlands so that wealthy landowners could raise sheep instead of having tenant farmers on their lands. And it turned out in the long run that hasn't necessarily been a great idea, because nowadays, if you shear a sheep, it costs £5 to shear them, and you only get £1 for the wool. So sheep farming is not as good a business as it used to be. And these were my absolutely favorite animals that I saw. These are Highland cows, and they are so sweet and so friendly. And we saw them in several different places, and they always come over to have a look at you while you're having a look at them. And I thought they were just absolutely delightful.
That's great.
Our next stop was in Orkney. We stopped at a town called Kirkwall. And again, I had a choice of excursions. You could have gone north and seen Neolithic stones and also a settlement called Skara Brae. But I decided I was more interested in World War II. So I went south to see the Churchill barriers. The reason for the barriers is that in 1939, a U-boat slipped into Scapa Flow and sank the battleship HMS Royal Oak with the loss of 833 men. This was a real tragedy.
Yeah.
The battleship was basically just sitting there to protect the Scapa flow, but this ingenious U-boat commander got in and torpedoed it and actually got out without even being caught. So with that shock, they began to construct these barriers, which served to prevent any U-boats from getting in if they came again, but they also provide a causeway between four islands. Some of the people who worked on the construction of the Churchill barriers were Italian prisoners of war, and they were very well liked by the commandant of their camp. I guess they didn't give him a lot of trouble, and they asked permission to build a chapel, and he gave them permission. He gave them 2 Nissan huts, which are like Quonset huts, and allowed them to join it together, and they created this illusion entirely with paint. So, I mean, well, I shouldn't say entirely, the altar itself is made out of concrete, but the so-called stained glass windows are just paint, the tile floor is paint, the wooden area here is all paint, and so, and the lanterns were made out of tin cans that were refashioned into lanterns. So they did a magnificent job of creating a lovely chapel for themselves. And when they were all deported at the end of the war, the local people in Orkney maintained the chapel, and then eventually some of the Italians came back and touched these things up, and it's now quite a considerable tourist attraction. In Invergordon, I took a tour to Loch Ness. So in case you go there and you don't see the monster, here's the monster.
I like that.
Okay, our final stop was at South Queensbury near Edinburgh. Once again, that's a tender stop. Even though you're going to a big city, nobody docks there. You have to take a tender, and there's a big Forth Railway bridge there. We were asked to wait a long time to get off the tender, but I did eventually get off, and I took in the morning that I took a bus into Edinburgh and just wandered around. I'd been to Edinburgh quite a few times before, so I didn't do anything terribly exciting there. And then I went back out to the dock, and because of the difficulty of getting on and off the tenders, I waited on the dock until my afternoon tour to St. Andrews. And there were pipers on our on the dock there to entertain me. And then eventually along came this gentleman with the gray hair, and he was our tour guide for St. Andrews. And he looked quite good in his kilt, and I think he knew that. The ruin behind him is actually a church and a cathedral in St. Andrews that's been a ruin for 1,000 years, I guess. And I was one of the few people who went around and toured a little bit of the town of St. Andrews. All the men on the bus just wanted to go for the golf stuff. So they all got off as soon as we got to the golf course, and just 2 women stayed on the bus for the rest of it. There's a university in St. Andrews. It has 11,000 something students. It's quite a good university. The town itself only has 16,000 people, so it's not a very big town, and none of the university buildings were very exciting. The golf course, however, was pretty nice, and you could see it very, very easily. It happened to be a lovely day. It was warm, it was pleasant, it was a very slight breeze, nothing much, and you could just enjoy being able to look at the golf course. You could see the first hole and the 18th hole and the putting green. And the picture down in the lower right-hand side is a hotel, and there's a bridge in front of it that leads across the course itself. I found out that, this is the Royal and Ancient Clubhouse. The R&A is sort of the dominant force in golf outside of the United States, and to be a member of this club is quite a privilege. And you can't get into the club at all, of course, if you're not a member, but you can actually play the course. I didn't realize that, but there are not only the old course, but there are several other courses there, and they're held in trust and the public is actually allowed to play on them. You have to make arrangements, of course, but it's not a totally closed off environment. So that would be certainly very interesting. We then drove back. And when we drove back, the weather changed completely. completely. So going from the sunshine, we get back and there's a storm brewing, and the tide's in, half the dock has disappeared. And I tried to get into the tender, and I lifted my foot as much as I could, 1 foot, but I didn't quite get the other one over, so I fell into the tender, which was embarrassing. It didn't hurt me, fortunately, and the crew did help me up with that sailor's grip, and that saved the day. And so Edinburgh and St. Andrews was our last port of my cruise, and our next stop was back at Rotterdam. And so I had 2 extra sunny days in the Netherlands, in part because my flight home was canceled and I had to go home the next day after in order to get a business class ticket. So I spent 1 day in Delft and another day in Leiden, and I enjoyed it because I feel very comfortable in the Netherlands. So that's pretty much it.
Wow. Yay, loved it.
Are you still awake?
Oh, yes, I am.
Thank you, Martha and Mary. Was a lovely self-tour here for
Yes.
those of us that have.
I tell you guys did such a wonderful job.
Yeah, this was a
It was
great.
very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really very nice.
Yes, it was very, very.
Well, I have to say that I am honored that Mary invited me to make a Zoom trip with her. She is the Anthony Bourdain of travel. She reminds me of Lowry Stokes Sims at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And Mary knows how to do PowerPoint.
Martha, you were a good storyteller.
Yes, I
Did
think.
you like that legend?
Well, it was interesting. I think it forced both of us to remember our trips better than we would have otherwise.
That's great.
Great.
We had to keep asking each other, well, what did you do there? And what did you see? You know?
Another thing that you did was you went through your pictures before they left your head.
Yes.
Yes.
Exactly. Yes, right. So we have better memories of it. But I hope we were also very honest with you about some of the challenges, like the Zodiacs and getting off on the tender, so that you know that it is strenuous. And I do notice the difference in age now in terms of my ability to do all of these things. So you have to bear that.
What age? Well, it was a great trip. Can't say that it was my favorite because we were supposed to have tenders and we did not. We had those Zodiacs, but it became an adventure. So it was okay.
Yeah.
So if you had to go on a trip again that only had Zodiacs, Martha, would you do it?
I might give it second thoughts.
Yeah. I would definitely look at any itinerary that I had that involved a lot of tendering from a big ship. It wasn't, I mean, yes, I had the fall, but that was really a kind of minor thing. But it was more the question of the delays in getting off and how long we had to wait if we weren't going on a ship's excursion. I found that frustrating because in Dublin, for example, I really only had basically a half a day with my family there. That was okay for us because we were only going for lunch, but it wouldn't have been okay if I had intended sightseeing.
Wow.
Mary, why does it take so long for the tendering? Is there just not enough tenders, or is it the time getting off that it takes people a while to get off and on, or what's the?
No, the reason was because the tender takes about 80 people on each one, but they reserved 60 places for people who were taking shore excursions that they paid for through the cruise company. So unless you had some special pull, you squeezed into the remaining 20 spaces, and there were hundreds of us who were not taking shore excursions. I mean, especially in a place like Dublin, you know, it's quite easy to go into the city center and travel around by yourself. So you might not have wanted to pay for a shore excursion, or I wanted to take a private one that wasn't sponsored by Holland America. And in both cases, you had this challenge of getting off the ship. I didn't encounter that on any other cruise that I've ever taken, but it was definitely a feature on this one.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was great. Thank
Yeah,
you.
you did a great job, both of
I
you.
see that Jill. Jill, did we say anything that surprised you, or did we get our our facts wrong?
We did not get our facts wrong. No.
She's got her mic muted, so we can't hear her. One other thing that I did notice, and I don't think I said this,
Bill, you're muted.
is that they have the same problems with getting help that we have. So in Southern England, so that,
Yes.
lots of places were closed, and they told us that hotels were only open 4 and 5 days a week rather than 7 days, and you'd pass a pub and it would be closed because they can't get the staff. And they are really suffering from that. And some of it has to do with Brexit and not having imported people in from Europe to work there.
Mhm.
They're having similar problems in in the
Mhm.
Netherlands and in other countries as well. The tourists themselves are back, but the infrastructure is not there.
Well, on my ship, because it was not full, it was really unfortunate for the owners because I'm sure they lost a lot of money. But there were so many servers that when I would eat breakfast, they would keep asking me, do you want coffee? Do you want milk? And I'd go away. I want to eat my breakfast.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, then I'm going to stop the recording and then
Good night.